I'm not the kind of person who believes in ghosts. That usually surprises people when they hear what I do for a living. They expect someone jumpy, superstitious, always looking over their shoulder. But that was never me. I chose this job because it was quiet, predictable. Because fire and machinery follow rules and rules don't lie to you. My name doesn't really matter. What matters is that I've worked as a crematorium operator for over a decade, mostly on the night shift. Before this, I worked industrial maintenance. Boilers, ventilation systems, pressure gauges. Heat doesn't scare me. Machines don't scare me. If something goes wrong, there's always a reason you can find with enough patience and the right tools. That's what I believed when I started. The crematorium itself sits just outside town, far enough that you don't hear traffic, close enough that the road still feels familiar. During the day it's almost peaceful. Sunlight through frosted windows. Phones ringing. Families coming and going. There's a rhythm to it, paperwork, procedures, handshakes, quiet voices. You feel like part of a process that has an end. At night, all of that disappears. No families. No voices. No footsteps except your own. Just fluorescent lights humming softly above stainless steel walls and long hallways that seem to stretch further than they did during the day. The kind of quiet where you start to notice things you normally wouldn't. Your breathing, the click of a gauge needle, the low mechanical sigh of the ventilation system pulling air through the building. I like that kind of quiet. At first, people always assume working around death changes you. That it makes you emotional or numb or obsessed with what comes after. For me, it was the opposite. The longer I worked there, the more convinced I became that there was nothing mysterious about it. Body goes in. Heat does its job. What comes out is ash and bone. The process is controlled, measured, documented down to the minute. No room for ghosts in that equation. I tell myself that every time someone made a joke about the place being haunted, I'd laugh it off, tap the control panel, point to the numbers. Temperature steady. Pressure normal. Everything accounted for. Fear, I believed, was just what happened when people didn't understand how things worked. That confidence carried me through my first few months on the night shift. Night work paid better. Fewer interruptions. Fewer conversations. Most nights, I was alone in the building for hours at a time, monitoring cycles, filling out logs, sipping bad coffee that went cold long before I finished it. I learned every sound the place made, the click of relays, the faint pop of metal expanding, the way the doors settled when the heat changed. When you work long enough somewhere like that, you stop thinking of it as a place associated with death. It becomes just another workplace. Another set of routines. That's why it took me so long to notice when something felt wrong. It wasn't dramatic at first. No slamming doors. No voices in the dark. Just small moments where my body reacted before my brain could explain why. A sudden urge to step back from the reinforced glass of a furnace window. The feeling that someone was standing just out of view in a reflection. Gone the instant I turned my head. I told myself it was fatigue. Long shifts mess with your perception. Anyone who's worked nights knows that. Your sense of time slips. Your eyes play tricks on you. The mind fills in gaps when it's tired. So I ignored it. I kept trusting the machines. Kept trusting the numbers. Kept telling myself that if something truly strange were happening, there would be evidence. An error code. A temperature spike. A malfunction I could document and report. But the problem with the night shift isn't that things break. It's that everything keeps working exactly the way it's supposed to. No alarms. No faults. No signs that anything is out of place, except the feeling you get when the building goes completely still, and you realize the silence has weight to it. Like it's pressing in, waiting for you to notice. I don't believe in ghosts. I still don't. But after enough nights alone in that crematorium, I learned something important. You don't need to believe in ghosts for the night shift to change you. You just need to stay long enough to understand that when everyone else is gone, and the machines are still running, something always happens. And once it starts, you can't unfeel it. The first night I felt something was wrong didn't announce itself. There was no sudden chill. No flickering lights. No sound that made me freeze in place. If anything, it felt like one of the quietest shifts I'd ever worked. So calm that it almost felt generous, as if the building had decided to give me an easy night. I remember checking the schedule twice just to be sure. One cremation late. Routine case. Nothing unusual in the paperwork. I logged the time, ran through the checklist, and started the cycle the same way I had hundreds of times before. The furnace responded exactly as it should. The gauges settled. The low hum of machinery filled the room like background noise you stop hearing once you've heard it long enough. That was when I noticed how still everything felt. Not silent, still. The difference matters. Silence can be empty. Stillness feels occupied. I brushed the thought away and sat at the desk near the control panel, flipping through yesterday's logs. The fluorescent lights above me cast a clean, even glow. No shadows doing anything strange. No reflections out of place. Just steel, glass, and numbers. Then, without realizing it, I stopped reading. I had that sensation you get when someone is standing too close behind you. Not fear exactly, more like awareness. The kind that makes the muscles in your shoulders tighten before you know why. I didn't turn around right away. I told myself it was nothing. That spending too many hours alone can make your brain look for company where there isn't any. When I finally did turn, the room was empty. Every door was closed. The hallway beyond the furnace room stretched out exactly the way it always did, long, clean, untouched. I even felt a little embarrassed with myself for reacting at all. I laughed under my breath, shook my head, and went back to the controls. That's when I caught my reflection in the reinforced glass of the furnace door. At first it looked normal. My own face, tired and slightly distorted by the thickness of the glass, lit by the soft orange glow from inside the chamber. But something about it felt delayed. Like my reflection wasn't moving at the same speed I was. I raised my hand. The reflection followed, but a fraction of a second too late. It was subtle. So subtle that if I hadn't been staring right at it, I would have missed it entirely. I told myself it was the glass, the heat distortion, the angle of the light. All perfectly reasonable explanations. All things I understood. Still, I took a step back. The furnace continued its cycle without issue. No spikes. No alerts. The numbers on the display were steady and calm, almost reassuring. I waited for the feeling to pass, and eventually, it did, at least enough for me to breathe normally again. For the rest of the shift, I stayed busy on purpose. Cleaned surfaces that didn't need cleaning. Rechecked logs that were already complete. Anything to avoid standing too close to that glass again. Every time I passed it, I felt my body lean away without me telling it to. Nothing else happened that night. No more strange reflections. No sounds. No movement in the hallways. And that should have been the end of it. But when my shift ended and I stepped outside into the early morning air, I realized something that bothered me more than anything I'd seen inside. I couldn't remember the last time I'd checked the clock. Not because I'd been distracted, but because the night had felt shorter. As if time had folded in on itself while I wasn't paying attention. I looked back at the building, quiet and unassuming in the pale light of dawn, and felt a tightness in my chest I couldn't explain. I told myself I'd imagined it, that everyone has an off night now and then. But deep down, a thought had already taken root. That night hadn't felt wrong because something had happened. It had felt wrong because something almost had, and whatever it was, it now knew I was paying attention. After that first night, I started paying closer attention. Not because I was scared, but because I wanted answers. That's how my mind works. When something doesn't fit, I don't panic. I observe. I look for patterns. I tell myself there has to be a reason even if I don't see it yet. So I began treating my night shifts like quiet experiments, watching the building the way you watch a machine you suspect is drifting out of alignment. The strange thing was how ordinary everything remained. During the day, the crematorium felt like it always had. People moved through the halls. Phones rang. Doors opened and closed. I worked a few daytime shifts that week and nothing felt off, not even a little. The furnace glass reflected only what it should. The hallways felt shorter somehow, less oppressive. Whatever I'd felt on that first night seemed to belong to the dark hours alone. That's when it hit me. It only happens at night. Not late evening. Not early morning. The space in between, when the building is sealed, the parking lot empty, and the rest of the world seems far away. After midnight, when even the hum of traffic in the distance disappears and the crematorium feels like it's floating in its own pocket of time. I started keeping track without writing anything down. what time the feeling showed up, where I was standing, which furnace was running. I noticed that it never came all at once. It slipped in quietly, the way a change in air pressure does before a storm you can't yet see. The first sign was always the same, a shift in stillness. The machines would be operating perfectly, steady hum, normal vibration, but the space around them felt heavier, as if the air itself had thickened. Sound carried differently. My footsteps seemed too loud, then suddenly too soft. Once, I dropped a pen on the floor and flinched at the noise, shocked by how sharp it sounded in a room that moments earlier had felt muffled. I checked the gauges more often than I needed to. Temperature stable. Oxygen levels normal. Exhaust fans running exactly where they should. The logic part of my brain stayed calm, even as my body began reacting on its own. There were nights when I'd feel that familiar awareness on the back of my neck and turn, fully expecting to see something, anything, standing behind me. There never was. And that somehow made it worse. Because if it were imagination, it would have been messy, inconsistent. But this was precise, repetitive, always arriving the same way, always fading the same way, like the building was following a schedule I hadn't been given access to. The furnace glass became the hardest part. I avoided looking at it directly whenever I could. Not because I expected to see something specific, but because of how it made me feel, like it was offering information I wasn't ready to process. When I did glance at it, my reflection looked normal, sharp and immediate. No delay. No distortion beyond what heat normally caused. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that if I stared too long, something would eventually line up that wasn't supposed to. One night, while standing in the hallway between two furnace rooms, I realized something else. The building sounded different after midnight. The ventilation systems cycled more slowly. The clicks and pops of cooling metal spaced farther apart, leaving longer stretches of quiet in between. It felt like the crematorium was holding its breath. That was the thought that finally unsettled me. Buildings don't hold their breath. I told myself I was overthinking it, that anyone working alone at night in a place like this would start assigning meaning to neutral sensations. It's a known psychological effect. I'd read about it. I trusted that explanation because it let me keep doing my job without questioning my sanity. But the pattern remained. Night after night, the same subtle shift. The same sense of being noticed without being seen. And always the certainty that whatever was happening didn't belong to the day. By the time my shift ended, the feeling would lift, leaving behind nothing but exhaustion and a faint sense of embarrassment, like waking up from a dream you can't quite remember, but know felt important while you were in it. I never mentioned any of this to my coworkers. There was nothing to report, nothing measurable to point to. Just a sentence that kept repeating in my head as I drove home under a lightning sky. It only happens at night. And once I admitted that to myself, I realized something else, something I hadn't wanted to consider before. If it only happens at night, then the night shift wasn't revealing the problem. It was hiding it. There are several furnaces in the crematorium, each identical on paper. Same manufacturer. Same control panels. Same reinforced glass doors rated to withstand heat far beyond anything we ever put them through. If you line them up in a report, there's no difference worth noting. But when you work the night shift long enough, you stop trusting reports. I began to notice it with the third furnace down the hall. I won't call it unlucky or cursed. That kind of language still makes me uncomfortable, but it drew my attention in a way the others never had. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just consistently, like a presence you become aware of without remembering the moment it entered the room. During the day it behaved exactly like the rest. Cycles clean. Numbers steady. No maintenance flags. If I hadn't been the one standing alone with it after midnight, I might never have noticed anything at all. At night, though, it felt different. It wasn't that it malfunctioned. In fact, it ran beautifully. The temperature ramped up smoothly. The airflow remained balanced. The low mechanical hum was almost soothing. There's a comfort in watching something work exactly the way it's supposed to, especially in a job where precision matters. And yet, every time I passed that furnace after midnight, I had the distinct impression that it was already awake. That sounds ridiculous, I know. Furnaces don't sleep. They don't wake. They respond to inputs and follow commands. I told myself that over and over as I slowed my steps near it, as if moving too quickly might disturb something fragile. The glass was the problem. Reinforced, thick, slightly tinted. It's designed to let you observe the chamber without exposing you to heat or flame. I'd looked through that glass countless times before. Fire dancing inside. Clean, controlled, predictable. But with this furnace, the glass didn't feel like a window. It felt like a pause. When the furnace was running, I could feel the heat radiating faintly through the door the way you expect. When it was off, though, completely inactive, logged as cold, I still found myself checking it twice. 3 times. Not because the gauges said anything was wrong, but because standing in front of it felt like arriving too early for something that hadn't started yet. One night, there was no scheduled use for it at all. I'd already completed my work, updated the logs, and made my final walk through the building. As I passed the 3rd furnace, I noticed the glass catching the overhead light at an odd angle, reflecting the hallway behind me with unusual clarity. I stopped without meaning to. The reflection showed me standing there, hands at my sides, posture stiff. Nothing else. No second shape. No distortion. Just me and the long, empty hall stretching out behind my shoulders. Still, I didn't step closer. The feeling was the same one you get when you knock on a door and realize someone is standing silently on the other side, waiting to decide whether to answer. Not threatening. Not welcoming. Just present. I checked the control panel again. Cold. Inactive. Locked. And yet, the furnace felt engaged, like it was listening. I remember thinking how strange it was that something built to destroy physical remains could feel so patient. Fire is usually impatient. It consumes quickly, violently. But this wasn't that. This was restraint. Stillness. The sense of a process paused mid-thought. After that night, I found myself arranging my routes through the building differently. I took the long way around. I gave that furnace a wider berth, pretending it was just efficiency, just habit. I never stood directly in front of the glass unless I had to. Because every time I did, I had the same thought. It's not empty. Not in the way the others are. I can't tell you what I thought was inside. I didn't picture a body. I didn't imagine a face. It wasn't visual at all. It was the absence of emptiness, the sense that something had been set aside there and left untouched. Waiting. By the end of that week, the realization settled in quietly, without panic or drama. It was simply a conclusion my mind reached on its own, the way you accept an uncomfortable truth once you've walked around it long enough. The 3rd furnace didn't feel different because of what it did. It felt different because of what it hadn't done yet. And every night after midnight, as the rest of the building seemed to drift into a deeper silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for the right moment. And that moment had something to do with me. The night I finally understood I wasn't alone didn't begin with fear. It began with routine. No scheduled cremations. No deliveries. Just a long, empty stretch of hours to monitor systems and keep the building breathing. I checked the logs, signed off on maintenance notes, and made a cup of coffee that tasted burnt no matter how much cream I added. Midnight came and went without ceremony. The parking lot outside was empty, the road beyond it quiet enough that I could hear the wind brush against the siding. That was when the building changed. Not dramatically. Not all at once. It was the same shift I'd felt before. The subtle thickening of the air, the way sound seemed to lose its edge. My footsteps echoed once and then vanished, like the hall absorbed them. I paused near the control room and listened, waiting for something to confirm what my body already knew. Nothing did. The 3rd furnace wasn't scheduled to run. I checked twice. Still, I found myself standing near it, drawn there without remembering the decision to walk down that hallway. The overhead lights cast a clean reflection across the reinforced glass. The chamber behind it was dark. Cold. Empty. I told myself that again. Empty. Then I heard the sound. It wasn't a bang or a scrape. It was quieter than that, so quiet I almost missed it. A soft metallic tick, the kind you hear when hot metal cools and settles. Except there was no heat. No recent cycle. Nothing that should have been adjusting or shifting. I waited. Another tick answered, farther down the chamber, as if the sound had moved. My first instinct was mechanical. I checked the panel. Cold readings across the board. Locks engaged. I placed my palm against the steel casing, expecting nothing. The metal felt warmer than it should have. Not hot. Not even noticeably warm. Just not as cold as the rest of the room. A subtle difference you'd only notice if you were already paying too much attention. That was when I felt it. The unmistakable sensation of being observed. Not from behind, but from in front of me. From the other side of the glass. I didn't step back right away. I didn't run. I stood there, breathing shallowly, waiting for my reflection to do something strange. It didn't. It stayed perfectly aligned with my movements, steady and obedient. But the feeling didn't fade. Instead, it sharpened. It was as if the space between me and the glass had narrowed, like something was leaning closer from the inside. Not pressing. Not reaching. Just closing distance. I spoke without thinking. Just one word. Hello. My voice sounded wrong in the room, too loud, too thin. The sound vanished almost immediately, swallowed by the stillness. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the glass fogged. Not all at once. Not from heat. A faint bloom appeared near the center, the way breath clouds a mirror in cold air. It formed slowly, deliberately, and then stopped, leaving a soft, uneven circle that hovered where no warmth should have been. I didn't touch the glass. I couldn't bring myself to. My hands were trembling now, and I didn't trust them to do anything useful. I watched the fog thin and disappear, leaving the surface clear again. Behind it, the chamber remained dark. Empty. That word felt wrong now. Incomplete. I became aware of another sound, not a noise exactly, but a pressure change like the room had exhaled. The ventilation system kicked on a moment later, late enough that I noticed the delay. Air rushed softly through the vents, restoring the familiar hum I relied on to ground myself. The feeling lifted with it. Just like that, the weight in the room eased. The sense of proximity pulled back, leaving me standing alone with a cold furnace and a racing heart. I checked every system again. Everything read normal. Perfect, even. I finished the rest of the shift on autopilot. I avoided that hallway. I stayed in lit rooms. I didn't look at reflective surfaces any longer than necessary. When morning finally came, it arrived without incident, washing the building in pale light that made it feel smaller, more ordinary. But something had changed. Because that night wasn't about imagination or misinterpretation. It wasn't a trick of fatigue or light or heat distortion. It was the first time the building had responded to me. Not as a machine. Not as a workplace. As a presence. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I couldn't. There was no language for it that wouldn't sound unhinged. But I carried the certainty with me as I drove home under a colorless sky, replaying that moment again and again. I hadn't seen anything. I hadn't heard a voice. And yet I knew, more clearly than I'd ever known anything on that job, that I hadn't been alone. Not even for a second. And whatever had been waiting inside that furnace now knew I was aware of it too. I didn't tell anyone about that night because there was nothing to tell that would survive being spoken out loud. The moment you put words to an experience like that, it changes shape. It turns smaller, weaker, something people can nod at politely before explaining away. I knew exactly how it would sound coming out of my mouth. Vague, emotional, unprovable. A story told by a man who works alone too much and sleeps too little. So I kept it to myself. The next shift, I watched my coworkers closely. I listened to how they talked about the building, the furnaces, the night shift. Their conversations stayed safely practical. Maintenance schedules, overtime hours, complaints about coffee and paperwork. No one mentioned strange feelings. No one hesitated near the third furnace. They moved through the space like it was just another workplace. And I understood something then. If I spoke up, I wouldn't be sharing information. I'd be volunteering myself as the problem. In a job like this, reliability matters more than anything. You're trusted to work alone, to follow procedure, to stay calm around heat and machinery that can't afford mistakes. The moment someone thinks your judgment is compromised, even a little, that trust evaporates. I'd seen it happen to others. People quietly reassigned, watched more closely, eventually eased out. I wasn't willing to become that person. There was also the fact that I didn't want to hear the obvious explanations spoken back to me. Stress. Fatigue. The mind filling in gaps. I'd used those explanations myself for years. Hearing them from someone else would have forced me to either accept them or argue against them. And I wasn't ready to do either. Once you admit something doesn't have a rational explanation, it starts demanding more attention. It wants to be examined, questioned, chased. I didn't want that. I wanted to keep my world intact, keep my job simple, keep believing that everything I encountered could eventually be understood. So I said nothing. Instead, I made quiet adjustments. I stopped lingering near reflective surfaces. I kept extra lights on even when it wasn't necessary. I planned my routes through the building to minimize time near the third furnace, telling myself it was about efficiency. I double-checked locks I'd already checked, not because I thought something would get out, but because it gave my hands something to do. The hardest part wasn't the fear, it was the isolation. When you carry something like that alone, it changes how you listen to people. You start noticing what they don't say. You hear the gaps in conversations, the way certain topics are avoided without anyone agreeing to avoid them. Once, during a slow afternoon shift, an older coworker mentioned hating nights and stopped mid-sentence, like he'd said too much. He didn't finish the thought. I didn't ask him to. That unspoken understanding settled heavier than any explanation ever could. If there was a shared awareness, it lived in what people chose not to discuss. And I realized then that silence wasn't just my choice, it was part of the culture. A quiet agreement to focus on what could be measured and logged, and to leave the rest alone. Because acknowledging the rest meant changing how you walked through that building. How you stood near the furnaces. How you felt when the night grew too quiet. I told myself I was being practical. Professional. That keeping my mouth shut was the responsible thing to do. But beneath all of that was a simpler truth I didn't want to admit. If I told anyone, it would become real in a way I couldn't control. As long as it stayed inside my head, it belonged to me. A private anomaly. A single night that didn't need to define anything else. But once spoken, it would demand answers. Investigations. Conclusions. And deep down, I already knew something I wasn't ready to face. Some things don't want to be explained. They want to be endured. So I kept working. I kept my silence. And I convinced myself that as long as I didn't talk about what happened, it would stay where it belonged, contained, quiet, waiting. Just like the furnace. The longest night of my career began like every other shift I tried to convince myself was normal. Rain had started just before dusk, the steady kind that blurs the world into a narrow tunnel of headlights and wet pavement. By the time I arrived, the parking lot was empty, the building hunched against the dark like it always was, quiet, waiting. I told myself the rain would make the night easier. Fewer distractions. More white noise to drown out my thoughts. I was wrong. From the moment I stepped inside, the air felt wrong. Not heavy this time, thin. Like the building had been hollowed out, leaving too much space between things. The fluorescent lights flickered once, then steadied. The hum of the ventilation system came on late, as if it had needed reminding. I checked my phone. No signal. That wasn't unusual during storms, but it still tightened something in my chest. I set it down and started my routine, moving through the building with deliberate calm. I refused to rush. Rushing leads to mistakes, and mistakes give fear a foothold. Midnight arrived without ceremony. After that, time lost its shape. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof in uneven bursts. Sometimes it was loud enough to feel like pressure. Other times it faded so completely that the silence afterward felt unnatural. Each time it stopped, the building seemed to lean into the quiet, stretching it longer than it should have lasted. I noticed the third furnace before I realized I'd been watching it. Its control panel glowed faintly in the dim light, numbers steady and unchanging. It wasn't scheduled to run. I checked. Still, the space around it felt charged, like the air before static snaps across skin. I stood at a distance, telling myself I was just monitoring the room. Then the lights dimmed. Not off. Just lower. Enough to make the edges of the room soften, shadows thickening where the walls met the floor. The ventilation hum slowed, stretched, and then paused entirely. That was when the building went silent. Not the quiet I was used to, the low mechanical breathing that never truly stops. This was complete. Total. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring, that presses inward until you become aware of your own heartbeat. I checked the breakers. Everything was fine. I turned back toward the furnace. The glass reflected the hallway behind me, long and empty. My own outline stood at the center of it, rigid, unmoving. I stared at that reflection longer than I should have, waiting for the delay I'd seen before. It didn't come. Instead, something else changed. The reflection seemed closer than it should have been. As if the depth between me and the glass had collapsed, flattening the image until I couldn't tell where the hallway ended and the chamber began. I took a step back. My reflection didn't. It remained where it was, staring out at me with my face and my posture, but with a stillness that didn't match my breathing. I opened my mouth to speak and stopped myself. The thought of hearing my voice in that silence felt wrong, like an intrusion. A low sound came from inside the furnace. Not metal settling. Not airflow. A pressure sound, deep and restrained, like something shifting its weight without moving. The gauges didn't respond. The control panel stayed calm, indifferent. My hands went numb. I remember thinking, with startling clarity, that this was the moment people talk about later, the instant where everything changes. I also remember knowing no one would ever hear about it if I walked out of that room right then. I didn't move. The glass warmed. Not suddenly. Gradually. Enough that I could feel it without touching it, the heat brushing against my skin like breath. The reflection finally moved then, but not the way I expected. It leaned forward just slightly, reducing the distance between us even more. I felt seen. Not watched. Not observed. Recognized. The ventilation system roared back to life without warning, air rushing through the ducts hard enough to make the lights shudder. The reflection snapped back into alignment. The glass cooled. The sound inside the furnace vanished like it had never been there. I staggered backward, my legs weak, my balance off. I didn't run. I didn't scream. I stood there, shaking, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. The rest of the night passed in fragments. I checked systems on autopilot. I stayed in rooms with windows. I avoided mirrors, glass, anything that could show me myself from another angle. The rain eventually slowed, then stopped, leaving the world outside muted and gray. When morning finally came, it felt unreal, too bright, too ordinary. The building returned to its daytime shape, harmless and familiar. Every system checked out. No record of the outage. No log of the ventilation delay. There was nothing to prove the night had stretched longer than it should have. But I knew it had. Because even now, when I think back on that shift, it doesn't feel like a single night. It feels like I was there for much longer, standing in that space where time folded inward, where the building stopped pretending to be empty. And I understood something then that I hadn't before. The night shift doesn't just reveal what's there. Sometimes it lets it step closer. After the longest night of my career, I expected fear to fade. That's how it usually works. Something intense happens, adrenaline burns through you, and then time dulls the edges. You replay it enough times that it loses weight. Becomes a memory instead of a threat. That didn't happen here. Instead, the furnace stopped feeling empty. Not immediately. Not in a way I could point to or describe cleanly. It was more like the absence I'd grown used to. Cold steel, hollow space, controlled nothingness, had quietly withdrawn. The chamber looked the same. Read the same. Passed every check. But the emptiness I relied on was gone, replaced by something that felt occupied. The night after that long shift, I stood farther back than usual. I told myself it was caution. Professional distance. But the truth was simpler. The space in front of the third furnace felt crowded. The door was closed. The glass clear. No heat cycle running. And yet my body reacted as if someone had stepped too close into my personal space. My breathing slowed on its own, shallow and measured, the way you breathe when you don't want to be heard. I realized then that I was waiting. Not for something to happen, but for something to acknowledge me again. That realization unsettled me more than anything I'd experienced before. Fear at least has direction. This was anticipation, stretched thin with nowhere to go. I began to notice how often I checked the furnace without meaning to. How my eyes drifted toward it whenever the building felt too quiet. It was like a conversation paused mid-sentence. One night, after midnight, I stopped several feet from the glass and stayed there. The lights were steady. The ventilation system hummed softly. Everything was normal enough that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the change. Almost. Then I felt warmth. Not heat. Nothing that would register on a gauge or trip a warning. Just a gentle presence against my skin, like standing near someone who radiates body heat without touching you. I looked at the panel again. Cold. Inactive. I didn't move closer. I didn't need to. The sense of fullness inside the chamber was unmistakable now. Not a shape. Not a form. Just pressure. Density. The same way a room feels different when someone is standing just behind a door, even before it opens. I whispered without planning to, "I know." The word felt heavy leaving my mouth. It dropped into the space between us and stayed there. Nothing answered. No sound. No movement. But the warmth deepened, enough that my eyes stung, enough that my chest tightened like I'd been holding my breath too long. I stepped back. The warmth faded immediately, retreating to something distant but present, like a tide pulling away without leaving the shore empty. The message was clear in a way words never could be. It wasn't reaching for me. It was waiting for me to stay. After that, the building felt different even when nothing happened. The silence no longer felt neutral. Felt attentive. As if the walls themselves were listening, learning the rhythm of my movements, the sound of my footsteps, the cadence of my breathing. I stopped thinking of the furnace as a machine. That frightened me more than any shadow or sound ever could. Because machines don't notice you. They don't remember you. They don't adjust to your presence. Whatever occupied that space didn't need to announce itself anymore. It didn't need to lean closer or distort reflections. It had already crossed whatever boundary mattered. The furnace had stopped feeling empty. And I understood then that emptiness had been my protection. As long as I believed there was nothing inside, nothing waiting, nothing aware, I could treat the nights as temporary disturbances. Strange, unsettling, but survivable. Now, standing in that quiet hallway after midnight, with the building breathing slowly around me, I knew better. The furnace wasn't full. But it wasn't empty either. And whatever had taken up that space didn't need fire or motion or sound. It only needed me to be there. Alone. Long enough to notice. Morning arrived the way it always does. Quietly, without asking permission. The darkness outside the windows softened first, turning from black to a thin, colorless gray. The fluorescent light seemed harsher against it, suddenly unnecessary, as if the building itself knew the night was ending and was preparing to return to something more acceptable. I watched the change from the control room, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Nothing had happened after that moment at the furnace. No sounds. No warmth. No pressure in the air. The silence settled back into its familiar shape, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the steady hum of machines that had never stopped working. Part of me expected something, some final sign, some closing gesture, but the building offered none. By the time my shift ended, the crematorium felt smaller, less watchful. Just a place again. I did what I always did in the morning. I walked the halls, clipboard in hand, checking each room in the same order I always had. Doors locked. Panels secure. Floors clean. The third furnace stood cold and inert, its glass clear and unremarkable. No fog. No heat. No reflection doing anything it shouldn't. If I hadn't been there all night, I wouldn't have noticed a thing. The logs told the same story. No interruptions. No power dips. No ventilation delays. The numbers lined up perfectly, neat and reassuring in their consistency. I signed my name at the bottom of the page and stared at it for a moment longer than necessary, half expecting the ink to do something strange. It didn't. Day staff began to arrive in ones and twos, their voices filling the building with ordinary sounds, greetings, complaints, casual laughter. The quiet that had pressed in all night retreated, pushed back into corners where it didn't belong. The crematorium wore its daytime face easily, convincingly. I listened for any mention of problems. There were none. Someone asked if the storm had caused any issues overnight. I shook my head and said no. My voice sounded normal. Steady. The lie slid into place without effort, as if I'd been rehearsing it all along. I watched them move through the space with the ease of people who didn't expect anything to be watching them back. They stood close to the furnaces. They leaned against steel surfaces. They looked into the glass without hesitation and saw nothing but their own tired reflections. For a moment I envied them. On my way out, I stopped at the end of the hallway without meaning to. The third furnace was behind me, silent and still. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I could feel the difference anyway. Not presence. Not absence. Memory. The kind that lingers in a room long after the people who made it have gone. The kind that doesn't register on instruments or reports. The kind you only notice if you know what the space felt like before. Outside, the air was cool and clean, washed thin by the night's rain. The parking lot was filling slowly, the world reasserting itself with the confidence of daylight. I took a deep breath and told myself that this was the version of reality that mattered, the one that could be documented, shared, agreed upon. And yet, as I drove home, exhaustion settling into my bones, I couldn't shake the certainty that something had been left behind. Not in the furnace. In me. Morning had come. Everything was in order. Nothing was wrong. But the emptiness I'd relied on was gone, replaced by the quiet knowledge that the night had changed the shape of things. That whatever had waited and noticed and withdrawn before anyone else arrived hadn't vanished. It had simply stepped back. And I understood then why mornings in that place always felt slightly unreal, like a performance stage for people who weren't meant to see what the night had learned. Because when the sun comes up and the logs say nothing is wrong, it doesn't mean nothing happened. It just means the night knows how to keep its secrets. People ask why I'm still here. Not directly. Not with those words. But I see it in the way they pause when I sign up for another night shift, in the small looks that pass between coworkers when someone mentions how long I've stayed. Most people don't last. They move on to something louder, brighter, safer. Something that ends when they clock out. I could have left. I thought about it, more than once. I even filled out an application somewhere else, printed it, folded it, carried it in my jacket pocket for a week. Every night I told myself I'd turn it in the next morning. Every morning I didn't. It's not because I don't remember what happened. I remember everything. I remember the way the building feels after midnight, when the air settles and the machines seem to listen instead of speak. I remember the third furnace and the space it occupies, not just physically but the way it presses into your awareness if you stand still long enough. I remember how emptiness used to feel like safety, and how that illusion quietly disappeared. I'm still here because leaving wouldn't undo any of that. Whatever noticed me that night didn't attach itself to the building. It didn't follow a schedule or live inside the walls. It responded to attention, to recognition. And I know, without knowing how, that walking away wouldn't make me unseen again. So I stay. I do my job the same way I always have. I follow procedures. I trust the numbers. I keep my reports clean and my routines tight. I show up on time. I don't linger where I don't need to. I've learned where to stand and where not to. I've learned which reflections to ignore and which silences to respect. I don't challenge the night anymore. That might sound like fear. Maybe it is. But it's also understanding. You don't fight the ocean when you realize how deep it goes. You learn when to step back from the shore. Some nights nothing happens at all. Those are the hardest. The quiet stretches too long, and I catch myself listening for something I shouldn't want to hear. That's when I remind myself that attention cuts both ways. That being noticed isn't the same as being invited. Other nights there's a feeling. Subtle. Familiar. Like a room remembering you before you enter it. I acknowledge it without stopping, without speaking. I don't need to say anything anymore. I think that's the real reason I never told anyone. Not because I was afraid of being judged. Not because I couldn't explain it. Because once you understand the rules, whatever they are, you don't want to break them by dragging someone else into it. Some awareness doesn't spread by words. It spreads by presence. By staying too long. By noticing. I won't pretend this place hasn't changed me. I'm quieter now. More deliberate. I notice spaces the way other people notice faces. I trust my instincts more than explanations, especially when the explanations arrive too quickly. And yes, I still don't believe in ghosts. I believe in thresholds. In moments where routine thins and something else becomes possible. I believe that certain places remember the people who stand in them long enough, and that memory doesn't always need a name. The night shift taught me that. Morning will always come. The logs will always say nothing is wrong. The furnaces will cool, the glass will clear, and the building will put on its harmless face. People will walk through the halls and never feel what I feel when the lights dim and the world narrows. That's fine. They don't need to. I'm still here because someone has to be. Because once you've been seen by a place like this, leaving feels less like escape and more like abandonment, of responsibility, of balance, of an understanding that doesn't exist anywhere else. I stay because the night doesn't ask questions. It doesn't explain itself. It only waits. And now so do I.